Good day, students. You are welcome to study session 6 of NSA 307, which will discuss on carbohydrates as a macronutrient in the diet. Please sit back and enjoy this lecture. At the end of this study session, you'll be able to briefly explain the basic concept of carbohydrates. You'll be able to describe the process of carbohydrate digestion in the human body. You'll be able to explain the health effects of insufficient or excess intake of carbohydrates and how regulating carbohydrate intake is crucial to maintaining health. You'll be able to discuss diseases caused by a lack of insulin in the human body. Let's look at carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are one of the three macronutrients. The macronutrients, like we have discussed in the previous study sessions, include carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. Carbohydrates are made up of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. And carbohydrates are of two types. We have the simple carbohydrates and we have this complex carbohydrates. Glucose is the most abundant type of the simple carbohydrates, which is produced by plants through the process of photosynthesis. Simple carbohydrates contain one or two sugar molecules. The two categories of simple carbohydrates are monosaccharides, disaccharides. Monosaccharides contain one molecule of sugar. Examples are glucose, fructose, and galactose. Fructose is the sweetest natural sugar, and galactose is not found alone in foods. Disaccharides contain two molecules of sugar, the lactose, maltose, and sucrose. They are disaccharides. Lactose is formed when galactose is combined with glucose. Examples of lactose is milk sugar. Human breast milk has more lactose than cow's milk. Maltose is formed when two molecules of glucose comes together. Maltose is usually not found except as a breakdown product. Sucrose is the combination of fructose and glucose. It is found in maple syrup and honey. Diets high in simple sugars can cause tooth decay, can increase bad cholesterol, can decrease good cholesterol, and may contribute to obesity. The complex carbohydrates, when glucose are linked together onto more than two sugars, they form complex carbohydrates. Complex carbohydrates contain three or more sugars. Complex carbohydrates are categorized as oligosaccharides, polysaccharides. Oligosaccharides include raffinose and stacose. Polysaccharides contain many sugars that are linked together. Starches are found in grains and tubers. Let's look at the recommended dietary allowance for carbohydrates. The recommended dietary allowance, which is RDA for carbohydrates, is 130 grams per day to supply adequate glucose to the brain. The acceptable macronutrient distribution range, which is AMDR, is 45% to 65% of daily calories. Again, this is probably high for people that want to lose weight. However, the focus for carbohydrates should be on fiber-rich foods rather than whole grain. You should eat fruits instead of juices, eat vegetables and fruit instead of white bread, white rice, and processed food with added sugars. Let's look at the roles of carbohydrates. Carbohydrates yield 4 kilocalories per gram, and red blood cells use only glucose for energy, and nerve cells rely primarily on glucose. Both carbohydrates and fats supply energy for daily activities, but glucose is especially important for energy during exercise. Muscle cells require glucose for proper functioning in both aerobic and anaerobic conditions. Looking at carbohydrate digestion, salivary amylase is an enzyme that begins carbohydrate digestion in the mouth. It breaks down carbohydrates down to maltose. No carbohydrate digestion occurs in the stomach because the stomach acid inactivates the salivary amylase enzyme. Most chemical digestion of carbohydrates occurs in the small intestine. The pancreas secretes amylase that is released into the duodenum, and it begins long-chain carbohydrates it digests long-chain carbohydrates into maltose and then in the enterocyte. Maltose into glucose by maltase, and sucrose is broken down into fructose and glucose by sucrase. Also, lactose is broken down into glucose and galactose by lactase. All disaccharides are absorbed in the small intestine using active transport ATP, which is energy requiring, across the gastrointestinal tract enterocyte and into the bloodstream. Fructose is absorbed by facilitated diffusion, which requires no energy, unlike the active transport. Let's look at blood glucose regulation. If glucose is needed immediately in the body, the liver releases stored glucose from glycogen in response to glucagon, and glucagon causes gluconeogenesis from glycogen stores or from amino acids. Blood glucose levels are tightly regulated in the body. The liver and the pancreas are the main organs that control blood glucose, but muscle cells and other tissues can take up glucose from the blood and help lower blood glucose levels. Some hormones act synergistically with glucagon and can raise blood glucose levels high. For instance, epinephrine or adrenaline, and also cortisol, which is a stress hormone. They can raise blood glucose to a very high level. So diabetics in particular should try to avoid stress. Let's look at insulin and glycemic index. Opposing glucagon action is insulin. Insulin causes a decrease in blood glucose levels by increasing glucose uptake into fat and muscle cells and decreasing glucose release into the blood from the liver. If glucose is not needed immediately, then it is stored as glycogen in the muscles and liver. Some of the functions of insulin include increase glucose and amino acid transmembrane, transport into cells. It increases glycogen formation in muscle cells. Insulin also increases glucose conversion to triglycerides in fatty cells. Also, insulin increases nucleic acid synthesis. It increases protein synthesis from amino acid. The effect of insulin are mediated by the insulin receptors, and insulin receptors can vary in density in different types of cells. The insulin receptor is a tyrosine kinase receptor that is activated upon binding of insulin. Activation of the insulin receptor triggers a variety of actions, but if energy needs are not used, then insulin acts to store energy in the form of fat. Insulin works to decrease blood glucose level and use it for energy or store heat. Lack of insulin response leads to an imbalance, which is unopposed glucagon. It will increase blood glucose levels and decrease glucose to tissues, and this can lead to increased lactic acid formation and increased ketone formation. And ketones are acidic, and this can lead to acidosis in severe cases. Insulin and glycemic index. Food absorption rate varies with the type of carbohydrate, the preparation method, and its fat and fiber content. For instance, apples are high in sugars, but they have a relatively low glycemic index because they have a lot of fiber. Mashed potatoes have a similar amount of carbohydrate, but they have a high glycemic index. Most foods are eaten in combination in a meal, and the glycemic index also fails to take this into account. When you eat low glycemic index food, they can increase the good cholesterol, which is HDL, and decrease the bad cholesterol, which is LDL, and also lower the risk of heart diseases. Food with lower glycemic index include beans, fish, fresh vegetables, and whole wheat. The glycemic load is used to determine the effect of a food on a person's glucose response. It is determined by the grams of carbohydrates in a food multiplied by the glycemic index of that food. This gives the amount of glucose that will be in the blood if a certain food is eaten in certain amounts. Foods with a high glycemic index cause a sudden surge in blood glucose, triggering a large increase in insulin, which may be followed by a dramatic fall in blood glucose. Foods with a low glycemic index cause low to moderate fluctuations in blood glucose. Diabetes, which is a common disease, is related to the function of insulin to regulate glucose levels. It is caused by heredity, environmental factors, or both, often acting together. And these two types of diabetes, are type 1 diabetes, which is formally called insulin-dependent diabetes mellitus, or juvenile onset diabetes. And there's also type 2 diabetes, which is formally called non-insulin dependent diabetes mellitus, and or late onset diabetes. Type 1 diabetes, which is the juvenile onset, it accounts for about 10% or less of all diabetes, and there has been a very slight increase in type 1 diabetes incidence due to treatment that allows more people to survive and reproduce. Type 1 diabetes is an autoimmune disease, and it leads to destruction of pancreatic cells in islets. This leads to a complete loss of insulin production. Type 1 insulin is insulin dependent. Type 1 diabetes mellitus is insulin dependent because with or without replacement insulin, the patient will die. However, type 2 diabetes also may use insulin treatment late in the disease. Also, there are now cases of type 2 diabetes occurring early in life. In type 2 diabetes, the response to insulin is decreased. Early in the disease, insulin levels are above normal, but later in the disease, insulin levels fall and pancreatic beta cells start to die off. Thank you for listening. See you in the next lecture. Bye for now.